The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you shiver even if you weren't afraid. But Sarah was afraid. One moment she had been walking home from work, the next, she was here, wherever here was. She strained against the invisible force that held her in place, like a bug trapped in amber, her feet hovering just above the ground. The walls around her were metallic and smooth, reflecting a pale, eerie light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air smelled sterile, devoid of any life. She couldn't move her arms or legs, only her eyes, which darted around, desperately searching for a way out, for some understanding of what was happening to her. Then they came. Tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and large, oval eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. Their skin was a pale, sickly gray, stretched tight over their skeletal frames. They glided rather than walked, their movements smooth and eerily silent. They surrounded her, those eyes scrutinizing her with an almost clinical detachment. She felt like a specimen, something to be studied and dissected. The largest of them, seemingly the leader, leaned in close, its breath fogging the air between them. The leader spoke, its voice a cold hiss, in a language she couldn't understand. The sound was sharp, like shards of glass scraping against each other. Another of the creatures approached, holding a device that emitted a faint, pulsating light. Without warning, the light washed over her, and she felt a sharp pain in her temples, as if needles were being driven into her skull. She gasped, but no sound came out. They were testing her, probing her mind, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the pain, trying to remember anything that would give her strength. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, telling her stories of brave explorers, of heroes who faced impossible odds and never gave up. She had always listened intently, imagining herself as one of those heroes. Now, those stories felt like a lifeline, something to cling to in this nightmare. The pain subsided as quickly as it had come, and she opened her eyes to find the creatures still watching her, their faces expressionless, unreadable. The leader turned to the others and spoke again. They responded with a series of clicks and hums, their interest in her seeming to wane. They didn't see her as a threat, just a curious little thing, something to be toyed with. But Sarah was no toy. She might have been ordinary back on Earth, just a woman with a desk job and a small apartment, but she had always been resilient, stubborn even. When life knocked her down, she got back up. And she would get up again, even now. The creatures left her there, suspended in the air, as they drifted away to attend to other matters. She was alone in the room, save for the hum of the machinery and the steady pulse of the containment field that held her captive. But in their arrogance, the aliens had made a mistake. They had assumed she was helpless, that she wouldn't understand their technology, or have the will to resist. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail, every flicker of light, every panel and device. She didn't know how any of it worked, but she would learn. She had no choice. The containment field was strong, but she noticed a slight flicker, a momentary lapse that occurred every few minutes. It was almost imperceptible, but she saw it, and her heart leaped. The system wasn't perfect. It had a weakness. She began to time the flickers, counting the seconds between each one. It wasn't much, but it was something. As she waited, she considered her options, running through the limited resources at her disposal. She had no weapons, no tools, just her wits and the element of surprise. The aliens might have advanced technology, but they didn't know her. They didn't know that she was more than they could see, more than they could comprehend. The next time the field flickered, she focused all her strength on moving her arm. It twitched, just slightly, but it was enough to make her believe she could break free. She gritted her teeth and waited for the next flicker, her muscles tense, ready to act. The moment came, and she pushed harder, feeling the resistance give way just enough for her to move her hand. It was a small victory, but it fueled her determination. Time passed in a blur as Sarah continued to test the limits of the containment field, each flicker bringing her closer to freedom. Her body ached from the strain, her mind teetering on the edge of exhaustion, but she refused to give up. She couldn't give up. Finally, after what felt like hours, the flicker came again, and she threw all her strength into the effort. Her arm broke free, then her other, and she reached out, grasping the edge of the platform beneath her feet. She pulled herself down, breaking through the field with a final surge of adrenaline. She stumbled as her feet hit the cold metal floor, her legs weak and trembling. She was free, but she wasn't safe yet. The aliens could return at any moment, and she had to be ready. Sarah looked around the room, her mind racing. She had done the impossible, escaped from a technology she didn't even understand. Now she had to figure out her next move. The room was filled with devices and control panels, and though they were alien to her, she had to believe there was something she could use, some way to turn the tables on her captors. She approached the nearest console, her hands shaking as she studied the array of buttons and switches. She didn't know what any of it did, but she was smart, and she was desperate. And sometimes, desperation could be a powerful ally. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had no idea what she was about to do, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. The aliens thought she was a toy, something to be used and discarded. They were wrong. And she was about to show them just how wrong they were. With a steady hand, she pressed the first button. The dim light flickered overhead as Sarah stumbled through the corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been running, dodging through the labyrinth of metal and wires, trying to find any way out. But every path seemed to lead her deeper into the belly of the alien ship. The air was thick with the scent of something unnatural, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of machinery. She turned a corner and froze. There, in the shadows, was another human. He was leaning against the wall, his body still and his eyes closed, but there was something about him, an aura of calm, of control, as if the chaos around them didn't touch him. He looked different from anyone she'd ever met, his frame tall and muscular, his face marked with scars that told a story of survival and battle. Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but something about him drew her in. Before she could make a decision, his eyes snapped open, locking onto hers. They were a deep, penetrating green, filled with a strength that made her breath catch. He straightened, pushing off the wall, and stepped into the light. "Who are you?" Sarah's voice was steady, but she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing her worth. "Name's Jack," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "And you?" "Sarah." She felt a wave of relief. He was human, and right now, that was enough. Jack gave a slight nod. "You're the new one they brought in." It wasn't a question. He had already known, and that unsettled her. "How do you know that?" she asked, her suspicion rising. "Because I've been here a long time." He looked past her, scanning the corridor with a practiced eye. "Long enough to see what they do to the others." There was a gravity to his words that made Sarah shudder. She could tell he was a man who had seen too much, done too much, and yet somehow, he was still standing. "Why are you here?" "Because I'm useful to them." Jack's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Or at least, they think I am. They have no idea I've been planning their downfall for years." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "You're planning to escape?" He looked at her, really looked at her, as if assessing her for the first time. "I was. But things just got more complicated." He didn't elaborate, but Sarah understood. Her arrival had thrown a wrench into whatever he had planned, and now he had to account for her. She didn't want to be a burden, and something in her flared up, a spark of defiance. "I'm not helpless," she said, meeting his gaze. "I've already figured out some of their weaknesses." Jack's eyebrows raised in surprise, and for the first time, Sarah saw a hint of respect in his eyes. "What weaknesses?" She quickly outlined what she had observed: the flickering containment field, the patterns in the aliens' movements, the layout of the ship's corridors. Jack listened intently, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest. "You're smarter than you look," he said, almost grudgingly. "And you're not what I expected," she shot back, a small smile tugging at her lips. For a moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by a mutual understanding. They were both survivors, and they both had something to offer. The shift in their dynamic was subtle, but it was there, a recognition that they were equals in this fight. Jack sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze softening just a fraction. We might have a shot at this after all. But it's going to take both of us working together. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of his words. What's the plan? Jack glanced around, ensuring they were still alone, before stepping closer. The ship's heavily guarded, but they've got blind spots. I've been mapping them out for months. We'll need to disable the security systems first, then make our way to the hangar. There's an old transport ship there, not as secure as the others. If we can get to it, we might be able to slip away undetected. It sounded risky, insanely risky, but Sarah knew it was their only chance. And how do we disable the security systems? Leave that to me, Jack said, his tone confident. I've already got a plan in place. But you're going to need to be ready to fight. Once we're on that transport, it's not going to be smooth sailing. Sarah swallowed, her nerves tingling. I've never fought before, not really. Jack's gaze softened, but there was steel behind his eyes. You will. I'll teach you everything I know. We don't have much time, so you'll have to learn fast. And so began their partnership. Jack showed Sarah the basics: how to disarm an opponent, how to move silently, how to use whatever was at hand as a weapon. He was a patient teacher, though his methods were brutal, designed to harden her, to prepare her for what was to come. Sarah took to the training with a determination that surprised even herself, driven by the knowledge that her survival depended on it. As the days passed, they grew closer, bound by their shared purpose and the growing trust between them. Jack wasn't just a soldier. He was a man of depth and complexity, with a past he rarely spoke of but which Sarah could sense was filled with pain and loss. She found herself drawn to him, not just as a leader but as a person, someone who had lived through horrors and come out the other side stronger for it. For his part, Jack came to see Sarah as more than just another helpless captive. She was quick, adaptable, and above all, resilient. She had a fire in her that he admired, a will to survive that matched his own. And he knew that if they were going to escape, he couldn't do it without her. The day finally came when everything was ready. They stood side by side in the shadows, watching the alien guards as they made their rounds. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Jack turned to Sarah, his expression serious. Are you ready? Sarah nodded, her heart racing but her resolve unshaken. Let's do this. With a final, shared glance, they moved. The corridor stretched out before them, dimly lit by the eerie glow of alien symbols running along the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's engines. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, every muscle in her body tense, as she moved in sync with Jack. They had rehearsed this moment, planned every step, but now that it was happening, the reality of their situation bore down on her with crushing weight. Jack led the way, his movements smooth and controlled, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Sarah followed close behind, her senses heightened, every sound amplified in the suffocating quiet. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the edge of a blade. The ship was massive, a maze of sleek corridors and cold, sterile rooms. The walls were a polished, silvery material, reflecting the faint light and making the space feel even more disorienting. Strange, pulsating patterns lined the floors, their purpose unknown to Sarah but undoubtedly part of the ship's advanced systems. She could feel the ship's pulse, a low thrum that resonated through the floors, through her feet, like a heartbeat. They reached a junction, and Jack held up a hand, signaling her to stop. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow as she watched him peer around the corner. He was still for a moment, then motioned for her to follow. They slipped down another corridor, the walls narrowing, closing in on them as if the ship itself were aware of their presence. They approached a door, larger and more imposing than the others they had passed. It was the entrance to the control room where Jack planned to disable the security systems. The door was guarded by two alien soldiers, their tall, slender forms draped in dark, armor-like material that seemed to shift and ripple as they moved. Their eyes were like black pools, devoid of emotion, and their movements were almost robotic. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was it, the first major hurdle in their escape. Jack had explained the plan. He would create a distraction, drawing the guards away, while she slipped inside to deactivate the systems. It was risky, but they had no other choice. Jack turned to her, his expression calm but serious. "Stay low, move fast. I'll meet you inside." She nodded, trying to ignore the knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Jack moved first, stepping out into the open and immediately drawing the attention of the guards. They reacted with lightning speed, their weapons raised, but Jack was faster. He dodged to the side, drawing them away from the door and down the corridor. This was her chance. Sarah darted forward, her movements quick and silent. The door hissed open as she approached, and she slipped inside, her heart racing. The room was vast, filled with consoles and holographic displays that flickered with alien symbols. The walls were lined with panels that pulsed with light, their purpose a mystery to her. She approached the central console, her hands shaking as she reached for the controls. Jack had told her what to look for, a specific sequence that would disable the ship's internal security, giving them a clear path to the hangar. But as her fingers hovered over the controls, doubt gnawed at her. What if she made a mistake? What if she triggered an alarm instead? She pushed the thoughts aside, forcing herself to focus. She had come this far, she couldn't afford to hesitate now. Her fingers moved over the controls, inputting the sequence Jack had drilled into her. The console responded with a low beep, and the lights in the room flickered briefly before stabilizing. It worked. The security systems were down. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. She heard a sound behind her, a soft click that sent a jolt of fear through her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the doorway was an alien she hadn't seen before, smaller and more slender than the others, with eyes that gleamed with a strange intelligence. The alien stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan. The alien's eyes never left hers, and she could see a glint of something, recognition, understanding? And then it spoke, its voice soft and almost melodic, but the words were incomprehensible to her. Before she could react, the alien raised a small device, and the door behind it slid shut with a hiss. Sarah's stomach dropped. The room was sealed, trapping her inside. She glanced at the console, considering her options, but the alien was already moving towards it, its hands outstretched as if to undo what she had just done. Panic flared in her chest. She couldn't let the alien re-engage the security systems, not when Jack was out there depending on her. She lunged forward, aiming to knock the alien away from the controls, but the creature moved with lightning speed, sidestepping her attack and knocking her to the ground with a force that left her winded. She scrambled to her feet, but the alien was already at the console, its fingers flying over the controls. The lights flickered again, and Sarah knew they were out of time. Desperation fueled her as she charged at the alien, grabbing for the device it held, trying to wrest it from its grasp. The alien fought back, its strength surprising despite its slender frame. They struggled, grappling for control, and Sarah could feel her strength waning. She had to stop it, had to find a way to win. But the alien was relentless, its determination matching her own. In a last-ditch effort, Sarah slammed the alien against the console, using her body weight to pin it down. The alien let out a sharp hiss, its black eyes flashing with something like fury. But Sarah didn't relent, using every ounce of strength she had left to keep it there, to prevent it from undoing their escape plan. Just as she thought she couldn't hold on any longer, the door behind her slid open. She turned, her heart leaping with relief as Jack burst into the room, his face grim but focused. He took in the scene in an instant and rushed forward, pulling the alien away from Sarah and subduing it with a swift, practiced move. They had won, but only just. Sarah slumped against the console, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Jack stood over the unconscious alien, his expression hard. "We need to move now," he said, his voice urgent. Sarah nodded, pushing herself to her feet. The ship was still on high alert, and they had only a narrow window of time to reach the hangar. As they stepped out of the control room, the tension between them was palpable. They had come too far to fail now, but the threat of betrayal loomed over them, a reminder that they were not safe yet. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and ozone as Sarah and Jack sprinted down the corridor, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. Every step was a race against time, each second bringing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. They knew the aliens would come, and when they did, there would be no turning back. They burst into the hangar, their boots skidding on the smooth floor. The space was vast, filled with sleek, alien ships that gleamed under the harsh lights. But their focus was on the transport ship at the far end, their only hope of escape. As they ran towards it, the doors behind them slammed open, and the alien forces poured in, their black eyes locking onto the humans with lethal intent. Jack was the first to react, drawing the weapon he had scavenged earlier. A burst of energy shot from the barrel, striking the nearest alien soldier and sending it crashing to the ground. Sarah followed suit, firing off shots as she moved, her aim steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. The aliens returned fire, their weapons emitting beams of light that sliced through the air with deadly precision. Sarah and Jack ducked behind crates, using the environment to their advantage. The hangar became a battlefield, the air crackling with energy as the two sides clashed. The aliens' technology was far superior, each shot they fired was faster, more powerful, and more accurate. But Sarah and Jack had something the aliens didn't expect: human ingenuity. They adapted quickly, using their knowledge of the ship's layout and the aliens' patterns against them. Jack lobbed a small explosive device into a cluster of aliens, the blast sending them flying. Sarah took the opportunity to disable a console that controlled the hangar's lighting, plunging the space into near darkness. The sudden change disoriented the aliens, but not Sarah and Jack. They had planned for this, and they moved with purpose, using the shadows to their advantage. Sarah could feel the shift within her, the fear that had gripped her since her abduction was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, she was fighting to win. She moved through the darkness like a ghost, her footsteps silent as she closed in on another alien soldier. It barely had time to react before she struck, using the moves Jack had taught her to disarm it and deliver a blow that sent it sprawling. She was no longer the scared woman who had been taken against her will. She was a warrior, every action precise, every thought focused. Jack noticed the change in her too. As they fought side by side, he saw how far she had come, how much she had grown. She was no longer just a captive, she was his equal, a partner in this fight. He gave her a nod of approval as they pressed forward, taking down alien after alien, their movements synchronized, their focus unbreakable. The battle raged on, the hangar filled with the sounds of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. Both sides took heavy losses, but Sarah and Jack kept pushing, kept fighting. They had come too far to stop now, and they could see the end in sight. The transport ship loomed ahead, the ramp lowered and ready for them to board. But the aliens weren't done yet. A group of elite alien soldiers emerged from the far side of the hangar, their weapons glowing with a strange, blue light. These weren't like the others. They moved with a purpose, their eyes fixed on Sarah and Jack with a cold, merciless intent. They opened fire, and the blasts that followed were unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The energy crackled through the air, scorching the walls and floor, leaving destruction in its wake. Jack grabbed Sarah, pulling her behind a large metal crate just as a blast hit where they had been standing moments before. The heat from the explosion singed her skin, and she could feel the vibration of the impact through the ground. "We need to take them out," Jack said, his voice grim. "They won't stop until we're dead." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. They needed a new strategy, something that would give them the edge. Her eyes darted around the hangar, searching for anything they could use. Then she saw it, a control panel on the wall near the elite soldiers. It was connected to the ship's defense systems they could turn against the aliens. "Cover me," she said, determination in her voice. Without waiting for a response, she broke from cover, sprinting towards the panel. Jack laid down suppressive fire, his shots keeping the aliens at bay as Sarah reached the controls. Her hands flew over the buttons, inputting commands as fast as she could. She could feel the aliens closing in, could hear the hiss of their weapons as they prepared to fire. Just as the first blast tore through the air, she activated the system. A shield of energy erupted around her, deflecting the attack and sending it back towards the aliens. The force of the impact knocked them off their feet, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned the ship's automated defenses on, and turrets descended from the ceiling, firing on the aliens with unrelenting precision. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. The elite soldiers, caught off guard, were forced to retreat, their numbers dwindling as the turrets cut them down. Sarah and Jack took the opportunity to move, sprinting towards the transport ship. They reached the ramp, but just as they were about to board, a final blast from one of the remaining aliens hit Jack in the side, sending him crashing to the ground. "Jack!" Sarah screamed, dropping to his side. He was bleeding, his face pale, but his eyes were still filled with that same determination. "Go," he said through gritted teeth. "You have to finish this." But Sarah wasn't leaving him behind. She gripped his arm, pulling him to his feet despite his protests. Together, they stumbled onto the ship, Sarah dragging Jack into the cockpit as the ship's engines roared to life. She slammed the controls, and the ship lifted off, the hangar disappearing beneath them as they shot into space. They had made it, but at a cost. Jack's breathing was labored, and Sarah could see the pain etched into his features. But as they escaped the alien ship, leaving it crippled and burning behind them, she knew they had won. They had outsmarted, outlasted, and outfought the aliens. And now they were free. The ship drifted silently through the cold void of space, the stars outside mere pinpricks of light against the blackness. Inside, the air was thick with the remnants of battle, smoke, the faint tang of blood, and the lingering tension that refused to dissipate even now that they were free. Sarah sat in the cockpit, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the controls, her mind reeling from everything that had just happened. They had escaped, but the victory felt hollow. The cost had been high, too high. Jack was unconscious in the back, his breathing shallow, each rise and fall of his chest a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Sarah's heart ached, a deep, gnawing pain that no amount of relief could soothe. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing the surviving humans huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide with the realization that they were finally free. But there was no celebration, no cries of joy. Just a heavy, oppressive silence, the weight of their ordeal pressing down on them all. They had won, but what had they lost in the process? Sarah turned back to the controls, trying to focus on the task at hand. But her thoughts kept drifting, replaying the events that had led them here. She had changed, there was no denying that. The woman who had been abducted, terrified and helpless, was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who had faced death and refused to back down. But with that hardness came a loss, a piece of herself that she would never get back. Her hands clenched around the controls as she tried to push the emotions aside, but they wouldn't be ignored. The faces of the fallen haunted her, the memories of each fight, each moment when she had to make a choice, kill or be killed. She had done what was necessary, but the weight of those decisions was heavy, and she wasn't sure if she would ever be free of it. A groan from behind her pulled her from her thoughts. Jack was stirring, his face contorted in pain as he tried to sit up. Sarah was by his side in an instant, her heart leaping with a mixture of relief and worry. "Easy," she said, her voice softer than she expected. "You're hurt. Don't try to move too much." Jack's eyes opened, and he looked at her, the pain in his expression giving way to something else, pride, respect. "You did it," he rasped, his voice weak but filled with conviction. "You got us out." Sarah shook her head, unable to meet his gaze. "We did it," she corrected, though the words felt hollow. "But at what cost, Jack?" "So many." He reached out, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength. "Don't do that," he said, his tone firm despite the pain. Don't second-guess yourself. You saved us, Sarah. All of us. You were never a toy, never just a captive. You're a warrior, a survivor. You proved that. The words hit her harder than she expected, bringing a lump to her throat. She had been fighting for so long, pushing herself beyond what she thought possible, but hearing it from Jack made it real. She wasn't the same woman who had been abducted, she was more, and she had earned that through fire and blood. She squeezed his hand, a small, grateful smile tugging at her lips. I couldn't have done it without you, she admitted. You showed me what it meant to fight, to survive. I'll never forget that. Jack's eyes softened, and he gave a faint nod. And I'll never forget what you've done. We make a good team, you and me. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, easing some of the coldness that had settled there. They had fought side by side, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that went beyond just survival. It was a bond of mutual respect, of shared struggle, and it was something that would last long after the scars had healed. But as she looked around the ship, the reality of their situation set in once more. They had escaped, but they weren't safe yet. The aliens would come after them, and Earth had to be warned. There was no time to dwell on what had been lost. There was still too much at stake. She stood, her resolve hardening as she moved back to the cockpit. The controls felt more familiar now, more natural, as if they were an extension of herself. This ship, this moment, it was hers to command, and she would see it through. As she charted a course back to Earth, Sarah felt the weight of leadership settle on her shoulders. She was responsible for these people now, for getting them home, for preparing them for what was to come. It was a heavy burden, but she knew she could bear it. She had to. The stars streaked past as the ship accelerated, and Sarah found herself staring into the void, the vastness of space reminding her of how small they were in the grand scheme of things. But that didn't matter. They were human, and they had proven time and again that they could stand against the darkness, against impossible odds, and come out on top. Jack's words echoed in her mind, "You're a warrior, a survivor." And she was. The journey had changed her, but it had also revealed a strength she never knew she had. A strength that would carry her through whatever came next. As Earth loomed on the horizon, Sarah allowed herself a moment of hope. They had won this battle, but there would be more to come. The aliens had underestimated humanity once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. And when the time came to fight again, Sarah knew she would be ready. The ship descended towards Earth, and Sarah's grip on the controls tightened. She wasn't just returning home, she was returning with a purpose. The fight wasn't over, but she was no longer the helpless woman she had once been. She was a leader, a survivor, and she would face whatever came next with the same resolve that had brought her this far. As the ship broke through Earth's atmosphere, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. They had survived the unimaginable, and they would continue to survive. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it head-on, with Jack and the others by her side. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. And this time, humanity would be ready.